Okay guys, we are back. We are done with chapter 1. We are moving into chapter 2. We're going to get a little deeper into terminology and concepts associated with strength training, strength and conditioning. We're going to talk about different variations of strength training, how they help with muscular adaptations, how they assist with motor adaptations and neurological adaptations, and how all those contribute to increasing strength, increasing force production, increasing the speed at which we can fire off muscle contractions. So today we're going to get into some deeper stuff with the strength and conditioning components. So let's get into this. So essentially we have two different types of strength training, right? So when you want to improve your muscle strength and your muscle endurance, we can approach this from two basic concepts, two basic manners in which we can challenge the muscle. So the first is isometric, and I put that definition there from you so you can see it. Basically, in isometric contraction, you guys should know this: myosin and actin heads interact. A cross bridge is formed, but there is no lengthening and there is no shortening of the sarcomere, right? So the skeletal muscle is not contracting. However, it is maintaining tone and it is inducing force. Okay, but there's no movement of a joint, and there's no joint going through any particular range of motion, right? So we have muscle tone, we have muscle force being generated, but it is isometric or static, which is another word that is used commonly in the weight room or in textbooks. So we increase strength, but we have no range of motion, right? The joints are not moving. So then we have dynamic resistance training, okay? And there's three types, and within these three types, there's all these other terminologies that can get kind of confusing sometimes. So I figured out a way to kind of break those things down, deconstruct them, and explain them the best way that I can, so that you are not confused when you read about these type of dynamic strength training regimens, whether it's in this textbook or the NSCA textbook or the ACSM textbook. So the first one we are going to talk about is just dynamic consistent external resistance, which is also called DCER. This is also called isotonic exercise. So this is one that you guys are very, very, very familiar with, but this term here is synonymous with the isotonic. So what does isotonic mean? So iso means standing for constant, okay? So constant tension, right? Tonic is tension, right? So constant tension, that's what isotonic means. So you have constant tension being placed on the muscle through a specific range of motion, right? So this is the one that you guys you see in the weight room all the time, right? Isotonic movements. Here the weight does not change throughout the range of motion, right? So if you're laying down and you're doing a bench press, you have a certain amount of sets within that rep. A certain amount of reps within that set. Well, while you're undergoing those reps, the weight is not changing, okay? However, the tension on the muscle is being placed on the muscle in both a concentric and eccentric phase, right? So this is your average everyday weightlifting routine where while you're in a particular set and you're performing reps, the weight does not change, but the tension from that weight is being placed on the muscle through a concentric and eccentric range of motion. And also, when you are doing this type of weightlifting, the joints are going to move, right? And that's what's going to cause the weight to move through a specific range of motion, right? So here's some just extra things here that you can kind of read on your own, just, beating a dead horse. That's what I like to do, and just reinforce things. So maybe bench press lingo isn't your forte, and maybe you know a bit more about bicep curls, okay? So just kind of this sort of isotonic exercise can be applied to both bench press and biceps and squats and everything else. So just think about a weight remaining the same, the muscle having tension being placed on it, right? Through the load, the muscle is going to induce tension, and then you are going to have an concentric and eccentric contraction, which is going to move a joint through a specific range of motion. You guys know that one very well. Another one would be isokinetic muscle action. And this one's a bit more confusing, and I did find a video for you guys that will kind of help you understand it a bit better. So this, in an isokinetic muscle action, you have a fixed speed of movement through a range of motion. So isokinetic is now talking about rate, okay? And the resistance will vary with the force extended, okay? So we have machines where if you increase the force of contraction, you increase the speed, that will increase the resistance of the weight. And I don't know if you guys have ever used any of these isokinetic machines. I do have a video for you. So think about leg extensions where you're kicking your leg out. If you push harder on that movement, you're going to feel more resistance. So there are isokinetic machines where if you induce greater force, you induce it through an increase in speed, you will feel greater resistance. Where if you push slower, the resistance will be less, okay? So again, as you push harder through a range of motion, you will feel more resistance. That is isokinetic. Or if you push slower through a range of motion, the resistance will lessen, all right? And then the last one, which you guys all know, plyometrics. You guys are very, very familiar with this one. I hope. This is rapid dynamic eccentric contraction and stretching, right? Followed by rapid dynamic concentric contraction, right? So I have videos for you on this. We basically load the muscle or the muscle groups with a specific weight, or you just use body weight. So then you have either a rapid concentric load or a rapid eccentric load, and then when you put the body through a specific range of motion, then you do the polar opposite, right? And I have videos for you guys that will demonstrate this even more. So all I want you to take away from this right now is that we have 4 different ways of training the muscle. We have isometric, we have dynamic. Okay, dynamic has these 3 subunits in there. I have videos for these that will clarify these. The reason I'm giving you this slide is because as you go back and forth through the NSCA material and through the Fleck textbook, there's different terms, and some of them mean the same thing, okay? So that's the only reason I'm really kind of showing you this. And I'm going to show you new ones later down the road that have to do with like variability in strength training. So I just wanted to kind of get these out of the way right now. So let's talk about isometric, and let's take a look at this, okay? So let's beat a dead horse here. So we have an isometric or static resistant training, or we can have a regimen that has this folded into it. So should you be training isometrically? Absolutely. There should be a component of isometric training in your regiment, just like there should be a component of plyometrics, just like there should be a component of variability. It just kind of depends where you are in your regiment design. So are you focusing on power? Are you focusing on strength? Where are you in your regiment design? So again, this is a muscle action where there's no change in length, okay? There's no change in length that the muscle takes place. There are increases in strength that are related to isometric training, okay? And this also depends on the number of muscles that we activate. So if you are isometrically doing a curl, right, that means that you have your elbow and your arm at a 90-degree angle, and you're just isometrically contracting that bicep muscle. And if you're isolating single muscle groups, you're not going to have necessarily increases in strength. So when we train isometrically, the more muscles that we can activate for longer durations of time, the more muscle, the more strength we can create, okay? So we don't want to necessarily isolate small muscle groups when we're doing isometric training. We want to figure out ways of incorporating big muscle groups and synergist muscle groups when we're doing this type of training, okay? So frequency of this type of training is going to impact overall strength. Duration of muscle action in this type of training is going to have an impact on overall strength. And whether you're doing submaximal or maximal contractions, that's going to have an impact on overall strength. And what I mean by that, are you doing your 1 rep max, or are you doing 50% of your 1 rep max? 50% of your 1 rep max on a particular group of muscles would be submaximal, and the closer you get to your 1 rep max, you're getting closer to max. But interestingly, research in isometric training shows that both submax and maximal muscle exertion has increases in overall strength. So you can do submaximal isometric training and still have adaptations that will increase strength, increase motor unit firing, increase neural drive. Okay, so generally, isometric training is most commonly performed against immovable objects. So, some people will basically do a wall squat, right, where they bend their knees at a 90-degree angle. They place load on their glutes and on their hamstrings, and they use the wall for stability, and they see how long they can maintain that contraction. Some people might use weight machines. Some people might use isometric racks. So there's a couple different ways to do this, and I'll show you some variability in this. Some things that I do with my athletes where we train isometric training and we weave it in with dynamic training. So you can also use isometric and dynamic training together, and I will show you that momentarily. So another thing that's important for isometric training is this pause, right? These pauses and these holds, okay? So the longer we can have pauses through a range of motion, the longer we can have these holds, the more efficiently we can increase our strength at sticking points. Okay, so I want you guys to all think of a range of motion, whether it be a squat or a bench press, where you have a sticking point where, whether you're on the bench press and you're trying to push the weight back up once it's touched your chest, a lot of people have to arch their backs, right? And they arch their backs to help nudge that bar up to a point where they can press it again, right? So we all have these sticking points in our range of motion where the myosin and actin heads, they just can't produce any more force. So one of the things we can do is, if we can identify sticking points in certain ranges of motion, let's say it's a squat. Let's say once you go past 90 degrees and you're doing deep squats. Let's say once you go past that 90 degree while you're descending down towards the floor and you can't stand back up. Let's say you need somebody that has to spot you to help you stand back up. That's a sticking point. So what we can do is we can train our body isometrically at those sticking points to help build strength and tension there. So when we decide to ascend back up from that squat, we've trained that sticking point. We've trained that area that used to be weak, and now we can do that squat without having the assistance of a spotter. So there's ways that this isometric training will reinforce and strengthen dynamic training, all right? And we're going to kind of keep that in mind. So what does this isometric training look like? So we don't have to necessarily use a wall or an immovable object or a machine per se. We can do isometric training where we do a split squat, and we can have variability on how deep this athlete does this squat, okay? And let me kind of show you this here. So we can say, okay, well, you're going to do this split squat and you're going to hold this for roughly 6 to 10 seconds, all right? So between 3 and 20 seconds, if you look at the research, a lot of papers out there show increases in strength when you hold an isometric contraction from 3 to 20 seconds. Okay, obviously there's a lot of variability in there. If you are an athlete, you could probably hold it for 20 seconds. If you are a fair weather, you could probably hold it for 10 seconds. If you are brand new at weightlifting and strength training, you might want to hold it for 5 seconds. And of course, one of the great things about doing isometric training in this type of fashion is, after this individual does a 20-second split squat, we would have them switch legs and place load on the other leg, right? And this would not only strengthen both appendages equally, but most importantly, it would teach each one of these appendages to hold this position, and it would reinforce neural drive and motor activation in each of these kind of formation. So when I train fighters, I have them do this type of stuff all the time. And what I do is I make them start with their weak leg back. Okay, so in this position, most people are right-handed and right-legged, right? So when they stand in this position, this might be, so this would be weak leg back. You can see the left leg is back. So I would always have my athletes start with their weak leg back. And when the weak leg is back, we work on stability here, right? Because this leg is going to have to maintain balance. And when we're working on balance, balance is incorporated with motor activation and neural drive, right? So, and then I kind of have this leg here supporting most of the load. So this would be kind of my strength leg, right? So here I'm working on strength and tension. Here I'm working on strength, tension, and balance. And I always start with the weak leg back, the leg that has the least amount of balance. And then after 20 seconds, I have them switch and put the strong leg back. So why do I do weak leg first? Well, because if they get tired after that first set where the strong leg is back, then the weak leg is going to get even less attention because they're doing this sort of activity on a tired system, right? So I make sure that all their energy is focused on the weak leg first, and then when they switch and they have the strong leg back, then there's less energy required because they're more comfortable and they're more efficient in that stance. So not only can we work this split squat at varying putting different legs back and forth, but if you look over here, we can also do various degrees of depth, right? So you can have them do a 10-second split squat here and then drop the weight. So when they drop their weight more, we know that intensity is going to increase. And if intensity increases, let's think about motor units, right? There's going to be more of a drive from the neuron to the skeletal muscle, right? Because the system's getting tired and there's an increase in load. And if there's an increase in load, there has to be an increase in muscle tension. And if there's an increase in muscle tension, that has to come from the neuron, right? And think metabolically. As we go from here to here to here, what do you think is going to be building up within these legs at this particular point, especially if it's 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds? So you should be saying lactic acid or lactate, right? Or hydrogen ions, right? Those will begin to build up. So now we're working balance. We're working muscle strength, we're working increasing motor activation, and we're working metabolism. And if we have lactate and hydrogen ions building up here, then we're working on buffering those things, okay? So there's a lot of really great benefits that can come from this isometric training, and it can also be functional, all right? So it doesn't have to be just sitting against a wall. If you take the wall away, you increase the proprioception, right? You increase the balance component. So another thing you can do is if we have, let's say we wanted to do a partial deadlift, we can have resistor bands here on both sides, as you can see here. We can have the really thick ones, so there's a lot of tension. And we can tell our athlete to engage this apparatus here. We can have them do a partial deadlift and thrust their hips forward, and we can have them hold this for 15 to 20 seconds, okay? Or if it's somebody that's new, 5 to 10 seconds, right? So we can do this isometric functional contraction, right? Because here we're activating the posterior chain, we're activating several synergists, we're activating several muscle groups, and this resistor band is keeping us from going through a range of motion, okay? So this is another fantastic way to induce isometric, or to utilize isometric training in a functional capacity. Same thing here. We can see this individual's doing hip thrusters. They got the resistor bands around the hips. They have one leg up, and you can, hopefully you understand that having one leg up is going to increase the balance component on this leg, especially when you have a counterforce trying to pull your hips back down. So with one leg being up, that means that all of the balance is now being placed on this left leg. And that means that the neural drive and the motor activation is going to be enhanced here because now you have a single leg maintaining that, right? So again, this is the way we get rid of muscle weakness in the appendages. So if we were to do 30 seconds of this, and he is holding this isometrically, this is a static hold. After 30 seconds, we would have him drop his hips and put this leg down and do the same motion, right? And again, if this were my athlete, I would start with the weak leg, which is generally the left leg. Most people, the left leg is the weak leg. I would always have them start with the weak leg first, because generally the weak leg has a lot of catching up to do with the strong leg. And if you don't believe that, I want all of you to stand up right now at your desk, and I want you to hold a single leg. Let's try to balance on a single leg. So lift your left leg up and see how long you can balance on your right. And I would imagine most of you will be able to balance for a long period of time on your right because of the motor activation that you've done over the years on the strong leg. And then I would ask you to switch it, put your left leg down and lift your right leg up, and see how long you can hold that. And also see if you kind of got like that left leg moving around consistently, trying to find its balance during that time. So I always tell my athletes and the people that I'm training to become trainers, always start with the weak side so that we get the weak side catching up with the strong side. Here you can see a very similar thing. We have an isometric hold here. And then here, this is a great one here. If we want to activate several muscle groups in a functional capacity, we have 2 bars here, and we would tell this athlete to engage in a isometric contraction for 10 to 20 seconds, and he can't go anywhere, right? So he's creating tone here and force production here, but it is being held in a single place, and there's no range of motion. All of these things will increase overall strength and increase overall motor activation, increase balance, increase stability, increase sports performance. All right, so these are just kind of a couple examples to look at. If we look at the sarcomere, we can see we have an isometric contraction here. So we can see that the myosin and the actin, the cross bridge formation, has occurred, but there's no shortening of the sarcomere. So you can see that here's cross bridge formation, and here is cross bridge continuation, right? There's no power stroke, there's no force production, where when we have a concentric contraction, you can see that we have cross bridge formation with myosin and actin, and then with the concentric movement, we have a shortening of the sarcomere, right? You guys can see that the myosin and actin is together, working together and making that power stroke, which is bringing these bands together here, right? And then eccentric contraction, you can see the myosin and actin here, cross bridge formation is occurring, but the eccentric contraction is that elongation of those proteins, right? So the sarcomere, these bands here are getting further and further from one another. So this is what an isometric contraction would look like. And if we go back, if we think about this right here, if we think about the activation of the glutes and the hamstrings, this is the type of contraction that is occurring. The cross-bridge formation has been made, but there is no movement of that sarcomere. So there's no contraction, there's no elongation, okay? And if we look at the force velocity curve of this muscle, we can see that an eccentric contraction would rest on this side, right, the lengthening. We can see that the concentric contraction would rest on this side, the shortening. And we can see with an isometric contraction, okay, the force is equal to the resistance force. So look at, there is no change in velocity, no change in muscle movement. There is no change in sarcomere length. Velocity is equal to 0, and we have an equal amount of force being exerted from the muscle that is equal to the resistant force, okay? So these are just pictures to kind of reinforce everything, and again, just beat a dead horse, okay? So if we're talking about isometric program design, okay, like how do we fold this isometric training into our existing programs to get further adaptations, okay? So generally we have to think about weight, okay? Are we going to do a maximal versus submaximal exercise, right? When we go back to these type of training regimens here, these type of exercises, these are sub-max, right? We don't have any weight being placed on the bar. We're just kind of using bands. We're using our own weight. Oops, sorry about that. We're decreasing our height and increasing our height, right? So we're using our own weight to increase intensity, Geez Louise, I'm sorry about that. Here we are not using any weight at all other than the bar and the resistance here, which is this bar. Okay, so these are all sub-max muscle actions, okay? So we don't need to put tremendous amounts of weight on a bar because we could use our own weight, we can use resistant bands, and we can use other bars to be that counter force, right? That counter load. How many number of muscle actions and duration. So again, we want to have big muscle groups being activated at one time, not single muscle groups. We want big muscle groups that will activate antagonist, agonist, and synergist. We want all of those things working together. And as far as duration, most of the research says 3 to 10 seconds in duration is enough to increase overall strength, okay? 3, of course, being the least. So if you have somebody that is injured per se, rehabilitation, somebody that is new to this, somebody that does not have good stability, you might only want to do 3 seconds. If you have an athlete, you might want to do 10 seconds, okay? So there's a little bit of room to play with, and that's where you as a trainer have to understand your athlete. You have to understand what their needs are. So what I tell all my students is when you are a trainer, you are a professional observer first. You have to observe everything. You have to know everything about your athlete. Then you apply your knowledge secondly. So observe first, apply second. Okay, so if you have an athlete that 3 seconds, let's say they're a star basketball player, but when they do these type of exercises, they have no balance, they have no endurance in an isometric capacity. Well, then you're not going to make them do 10 seconds. You're going to make them do 3 seconds. And then you're going to watch their body over the course of a week or 2 weeks to see if 3 seconds is getting easier. And there's going to be little signs that tell you that, okay, it's getting easier. You might see less of their body shaking, right? Because when they're shaking and they're trying to find stability, that shaking is a result of the neurons trying to communicate with the skeletal muscle. So, that shaking will dissipate. They're trying to find their balance. That kind of quivering of muscle groups will dissipate over the course of time, and that means that they're getting stronger, okay? Now, when it comes to sets, a lot of the research shows that 4 sets of 6 repetitions, okay, 4 sets, 6 reps at 2 seconds in duration at 50% of your 1 rep max is enough to significantly increase overall strength. Okay, now let's say they do this for a couple of weeks and that becomes easy. Well, then we change it. We go to 4, we might go to 5 sets of 7 reps of 3 seconds in duration. Okay, so once you see a plateau, we have these things these variables here that we can play with, and we can increase intensity, right? We don't need weight. We can increase intensity through time to re-challenge our athletes. Okay, a big pool of research shows that 4 muscle actions, each at 30 seconds in duration at 70% of 1 rep max, has also resulted in significant increases in isometric strength. Okay, so we can do 30 seconds, we can do 2 seconds. It's all up to the trainer, but you just have to know these margins to operate in. Okay, so 4 muscle actions would be contractions, right? So you could have 4 hip thrusters, each one of them being conducted for 30 seconds, okay, and in duration at 70% of when your 1 rep max. So how do you get 70% of your 1 rep max? Well, we could go back to this, right? We could have both feet on the ground, and we could have let's say a barbell here with 130 pounds, right? We can get rid of the bands and put a barbell on here, right? So they could do that same hip thrusting action with more load and hold that for 30 seconds versus 10 seconds. So there's no right or wrong way to do this. You have to understand how to challenge your athlete or challenge the team that you are working with, okay? So I'm just showing you margins that you can operate in, okay? So frequency of training, research shows that 3 training sessions per week, usually sub-max, increases significant isometric strength. And so what does that mean? Well, that means if we significantly increase isometric strength because we're folding this into our training regimen, That is going to have a positive effect on motor performance, okay? And motor performance, of course, is the neurons and the skeletal muscle communicating very effortlessly with one another, and this is going to increase this isometric strength in a way where we increase our performance in sports, and that translates into any sport. So one thing you need to think about as a trainer is, what is functional movement patterns for your athlete? What is their sport? I train a lot of MMA fighters, a lot of jiu-jitsu guys, a lot of boxers. So you think about a jiu-jitsu guy, right? They're on their back a lot. They're scrambling a lot in very unique positions, okay? They're shooting to grab a leg. So this makes a lot of sense for jiu-jitsu. This makes a lot of sense for jiu-jitsu. This doesn't make a lot of sense for jiu-jitsu, but squats are shown to increase strength, so they would still do squats, but I would focus more on these and these and these for jiu-jitsu. Why would I focus on these? Well, because this is just like taking a shot. If you think about a wrestler that takes a shot to try to get the legs of his opponent and pick them up, this is very similar mechanics that we see with our jiu-jitsu fighters and our MMA fighters. So if I'm weaving in a isometric training regimen with my fighters, I want to make sure that I'm doing something that is going to increase their performance in a functional capacity, and I look at the things that make sense for these individuals, right? So if I have a pitcher, right? So I'm training a professional baseball pitcher. This might not make a lot of sense. This might not make a lot of sense, right? These sort of movement patterns might not be the best choices to increase a pitcher's performance. Now, this one might make a lot of sense because when they throw the ball, right? When they throw that ball, they take a giant step when their arm goes over their shoulder and they release the ball, right? So placing weight and balance on this lead leg makes a lot of sense because that's something that's a range of motion that a pitcher might be in. So just keep all that in mind. So one last thing on this, kind of beating a dead horse with isometric contraction. Let's talk about speed a little bit. Okay, so speed plays an important role in strength, overall strength development. So we can perform isometric contractions in two different ways, right? Maximal force is developed very quickly. So think about a plyometric, right? Or think about a power movement, right? Where you have that very fast ballistic muscle contraction, or we can have an isometric contraction that increases more slowly, okay, until it reaches its maximal force production, okay? So we can have one that is a 1 second force producing contraction, or we can have one that is a 4 second force producing contraction. So we can play with the speed of the contraction, and that's another variable that we can kind of use, right? So we have sets, we have reps, we have speed. Oops, let me go back. We have different placements where we can increase the load. You see here, this is far easier than this, right? Oh my God, the thing is so sensitive. I am so sorry. We have single leg versus double leg. We have resistabands versus barbells with weight on them. We could put, instead of this gentleman being like this, we could put a Bosu ball under him and work a dynamic isometric contraction. So there's all these variables that we can play with to increase intensity. We can play with the speed of the contraction, right? Is it a slow isometric contraction or is it a quick isometric contraction? If I had a Bosu ball here, well, obviously he would be constantly trying to find balance and stability. So there would be quicker isometric contractions trying to find that balance. Okay, so all of these things we can play with. Both fast and slower isometric contractions will increase maximal strength, okay? Increase maximal isometric force capabilities. If we have maximal force is developed in 4 seconds, this results in modifications where the nervous system is really enhanced, where if we have this maximum contraction that is done very quickly, there's more adaptations that happen to the contractile muscle properties. And I apologize, these are the wrong colors. So let me just fix something for you guys here, because I don't want to confuse you. And I just want to use this cool pen, the Humboldt Space Pen. So maximum force is developed as quickly as possible. Okay, so let me draw that to here. Okay, so when we have very quick isometric contractions, okay, where the training is developed very quickly, this results in adaptations to contractile tissue properties. Okay, so the quick contractions have more of an impact on skeletal muscle. Now let me do this guy here, where if we have the slower 4-second contractions, okay, let me go here. That has more of an impact on the nervous system, okay? So what does that mean? Well, that means we train both of them. We don't just do one. We make sure that if we're doing 4 isometric training sessions, or we're doing 4 strength training sessions within a week, I would say it would be super beneficial to your athlete to have 2 isometric components that are very quick, and we are working the neurons more than anything else. And then we have 2 days of isometric work where we're doing more slow contractions, and that's working more of the skeletal muscle adaptation. So let's do both of them, all right? They both have benefits in increasing strength, increasing sport performance. So here is a way where I have this video of an isometric contraction that is done for 4 to 5 seconds, right? So we're putting more load on the muscle. And after the isometric contraction, we are going to go into a dynamic movement. And this machine, let me go back to something here for you guys. This machine is going to be an isokinetic muscle action as well. And I'll explain that to you in a second. The harder and the more forcefully he stands up in this squat, the greater the resistance will be on this flywheel. Where if the squat is slower, the less the resistance will be on this flywheel. Okay, so this is an isometric contraction for 4 seconds, 4 to 5 seconds. And then he's going to go into a type of exercise that is isokinetic. And the harder he exerts force, the more resistance this machine is going to give him. The slower or the lighter he exerts force, the less resistance this machine is going to give him. So let's watch this, okay? And let's count how long he is remaining in this isometric contraction, and then you will see him pop up and go into an isokinetic movement, okay? So okay, so that first video there, we can watch it again. I counted about 6 seconds, maybe 7 seconds in his isometric contraction. The trainer held the wheel to induce a counter force to his squat. And then once the trainer said go, he did isokinetic squats for about 10 seconds. Okay, so we don't have to just do isometric work independently, and I personally don't do it independently. I fold it into other movements. Okay, so I constantly mix isometric with dynamic. All right, let's watch it one more time and just kind of count how many seconds he's doing this contraction, and then we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so you got a chance to see it again. So I'm just bringing these videos to you because we can't be in the weight room, so I'm really kind of searching to find some really good videos to demonstrate this. Okay, so let's look at this. Oops, let's not look at that again. Okay, so here is another example where we're doing several muscles at the same time, right? So we've got the core engaged, we got the glutes engaged, the hamstrings, the quads, the synergist, they're all being engaged here. You can see that the squat bar is locked in. So this individual is going to do a quicker force production in a squat position, and hers are going to be 3 seconds. Okay, so again, 3 seconds are going to be more neural in nature, right? It's going to stimulate the neuron and the motor unit a bit more, where the longer the contraction, it's more muscle adaptations. Okay, so let's watch this one and look at what she's doing. She's doing 3 second hold, rest, 3 second hold, rest, 3 second hold, rest. Okay, and she's doing it in this functional manner. Here we go. Okay, let's watch it one more time. I'm counting about 3 seconds. So now this exercise is truly isometric in nature. There's really no other movements involved in this, in her movement pattern, right? So like the first one, we saw that there was isokinetic mixed with dynamic movement, mixed with isometric. And in this one, it's truly isometric in nature. So the next one I want to show you is something where we're adding strength, dynamic movement, or let's go back to our terminology. Okay, so we're going to use this next one I'm going to show you is going to be isometric, and it's going to be isotonic. Okay, so we're going to be doing these two together. So not only is it isotonic, it's also dynamic constant external resistance. Okay, so again, these are synonymous with one another. So let's go look at this next one here. Okay, this guy is a monster. That is a big trap bar deadlift right there. So what you're going to see on this one is he is going to go through a full range of motion. The weight is constant, right? That's why it's isotonic. It's a constant tension, constant load. The load here is not changing, but you're going to see that he is going to lift the weight and he's going to pause right about here. And I told you that sometimes we have sticking points in muscle. So a good way to overcome a sticking point is to train that sticking point, okay? So the hardest part of a deadlift, the range of motion that is hardest, is from here to here. And then once you get that weight past the knee, then these other muscles, your hips, your back, everything else can engage and get that weight up, all right? So from here to here is where most people struggle, right? From the floor to about the knee. So watch what this guy is going to do. He is going to isometrically pause right about here, okay? And he's going to keep it there for about 3 seconds, and then he will go through the full range of motion. So this is a way where he is working on that sticking point, he's strengthening that sticking point, and he is going to add isometric and isotonic together. And again, you'll see eccentric contraction, you'll see concentric contraction, you'll see isometric contraction, and the weight is not changing. The load is unchanged. So here we go. Sorry, the kids are in school. You can probably hear them in the background. So you can see how he's purposely hanging for about 2 seconds there, right? So that 2 second contraction is working on that the motor unit, the neural drive, right? And then he's going through that full range of motion. Let's try it one more time, and I'll kind of count. Okay, so here we go. You can see he's struggling from lifting it off the ground. Okay. He's going to hang purposely right there. 1, 2, up. Down again. Off the floor. Hang purposely. 1, 2, up. All right. So again, these are manners in which we can apply both isometric and isotonic training together, and I encourage all of you to do so. In your textbook, it shows that rock climbing and isometric strength training are essentially the same, so you guys can read that. I mean, if you think about rock climbing, I know a lot of people rock climb here in Humboldt at some of the local beaches and at the indoor rock climbing park. And if you think about that muscle action, rock climbing is a lot of static and isometric contraction. I would say that that is one of the few exercises where the isometric contraction is much longer than the isotonic contraction or the dynamic movement, right? Because it seems like you take a step and you kind of hold on for a few seconds until you find your footing and you go into that next movement, right? So that's one of those unique exercises where you have this isometric contraction folded in with dynamic movement. So think about that. Is rock climbing a activity we do for fun, or is it like a really useful training apparatus or training methodology where you can really increase the isometric strength in an athlete? So if you have athletes that are getting bored of the same training regimen, you say, okay, today's your day off, go to the rock climbing park and, you know, have a good time. And sometimes you have to lie to your athletes. Again, you need to observe first and then prescribe secondly. So sometimes when they're getting tired or they're getting bored of the same regiment, you have to think, right? Like sometimes I lie to my children and I have to use reverse psychology, right, in order to get my way. So sometimes with your athletes, you have to do that and say, oh, you know what, here's $20. You and you know, your buddy go to the rock climbing park on me and just enjoy yourselves and have a day off. And they might think it's a day off, but they're really working a tremendous amount of isometric strength. So sometimes we just have to do that. So now let's talk a little bit about dynamic movements and dynamic exercise. So that would be your basic movement, right? The movement that we see in the gym all the time. So if we start talking about program design and we're talking about this isotonic work, here's some things that we need to be aware of. Number of sets and repetitions that we have to do in order to get strength gains. So your textbook says that the sets range from 1 to 6. All right, so 1 to 6 sets, and again, it depends on the athlete. You are and someone who observes first, someone that prescribes secondly. Okay, so anything from 1 to 6 reps or 1 to 20 sets have resulted in increases in strength. Okay, so something is better than nothing. All right, if you do one set of 1 to 20 reps, you will have slight increases in strength. If you do the higher range here, 6 sets with 10 reps, you will have more robust increase in strength. All right. Training frequency, the American College of Sports Medicine recommends that you should train 2 to 3 sessions per week for major muscle groups. But if we look at NSCA, this is what this course is focusing on, is NSCA. We see that frequencies per week is based upon how advanced or if they're a beginner at this. So if they're a beginner, 2 to 3 times per week will have a significant increase in strength. If they're intermediate, well, you got to do a little more, and it's slightly more. And if you're advanced, it takes a lot more to get those gains. So with any one of these variables that we've been talking about, right? Frequency, sets, weights, 1 rep max, rest time, whatever we're manipulating with our program design, the beginners are always going to have more substantial, more significant, and more robust gains than someone who is advanced. All right. So especially at the beginning of the program, you will see that these people generally tend to increase strength by 20% when they first start a weightlifting regimen, where these people might only increase 6 to 9% because they're advanced. A lot of those adaptations have already happened, right? And when you have robust adaptations, what do you do to keep yourself from plateauing? Well, if you're already at the ceiling of your performance, how much more weight can you really add before you're starting to get injured, right? So you have to keep those things in mind is once we're, obviously this person's in the basement, this person's at the ceiling, there's plenty of room to grow here, where these individuals, there's not as much room to grow because they've already undergone all the training. They have all the adaptations. How many more sets and reps can you make them do? How much more weight can you put on? So like once you get to this stage, it's more about maintaining and having kind of more small increases in strength and increases in endurance, rather than here where these people will have just massive increases, right? So, and again, we know if you're training 7 days a week, you are going to get injured. So I would say, from my own experience, right, and I have a lot of years invested in training fighters, 4 to 5 is pushing it. Especially with strength training, 5 is really pushing it. So you need to watch for signs of fatigue, mental fatigue, emotional fatigue, physical fatigue, changes in behavior, changes in emotion. Your athletes, when you're overtraining, they'll look tired all the time. They'll look disinterested. They'll lose their appetite. So you observe first. And go back to that first slide that you see at the beginning of this video. Everything is connected. Everything is important. So if you're here, if the strength training is too much, then that means if they're also doing skill fitness, that's going to be too much. It's all connected. So you got to find that nice middle ground for everything. These are just some research projects where they look at frequency, training days, and body parts. So if you need some guidance, and I would say you probably want to pay attention to this, because I'm sure there's going to be some labs where I ask you to design something for me. The way I currently have my fighters lift is 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and they do total body. And why do we do total body? Well, because you're in the gym less period of time. There's less time for isolation. There's more muscle groups than there are training days, right? So you have to do whole body. And also with MMA fighters, we want to train whole body. We do not want to isolate anything. We do not want to gain strength in isolation in any capacity, because that will hurt their performance. So you think about that as well. How might muscle groups be activated in a way that your athlete is going to benefit from, right? If you do 4 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, here's a way you can break that up. If you don't want to do neck, you can kind of do other sorts of things. Sorry, let me go back to that. Jeez Louise, this thing's so sensitive. 6 days a week, I would not advise you to do any muscle training 6 days a week. That's overkill. And if you're an athlete, there's other things you're doing. If you're a football player, and you're lifting 6 days a week, well, when is your practice? How long are your practices? Are you doing 2 days? Are you doing weightlifting in the morning and your skill fitness, which is your practice, right? If you're a running back, you're sprinting and you're doing lots of running, is this training going to interfere with the skill portion of your performance? So these are the variables that we have to keep in mind, and we have to know as trainers. Think of the 3 bears. This is too hot. This is too cold. This is just right. If I have an athlete that is a tennis player, this might be too hot. This might be too cold. This might be just right, right? You got to figure that out. And just more research to kind of show that. And this is old research. I don't know why they're using this in the textbook. I wouldn't even look at this anymore. If you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 5 different ways we can train. Okay, if we train 1 day a week, what % improvement will we have in strength? And the only place we see significance in strength in male athletes is when they train 3 days a week, right? There's a 32% increase in strength. Or 5 days a week, there's a 41% increase in strength. So if you're looking at evidence-based material and you're a trainer, you might want to go to the literature and say, okay, well, in these athletes, where are they seeing the greatest? Where is that sweet spot? What is too hot? What is too cold? What is just right? In this particular study, this was too hot, this was too cold, this was just right, and this was just right. We can see that they had the most increases in strength. That's significant asterisks, right? And the same thing here. In this study, 3 to 4 days a week, we can see that this is not significant, but it was trending, right? Or this was trending towards significance. In this particular study, 3 to 4 days a week, we could see that 4 days a week right here was more significant than 3 days a week. And here we can see that 4 days a week was more significant than 3 days a week. So go to the literature and see what previous researchers have done to identify what is the sweet spot. So let's talk a little bit about some of the training things that we need to keep in mind. When we do this type of training, it has a significant increase. So when we do dynamic training, it has a significant increase on motor performance. So research has shown that strength training increases vertical jump, it increases the long jump, it increases the shuttle run. So what is this? This is all power. What does strength training tell us about power? Well, fundamentally, we want to increase strength, and as a result, power will increase with increases in strength. So we always want to train strength first as a foundation, and then we build skill and power on top of strength. Okay, so when we do this type of training, dynamic training, there are significant increases in 1 rep max with both men and women, and I just kind of showed you that, right? So when we do 3 to 5 days a week, 3 to 4 days a week, there is significant increases in strength, which means that your 1 rep max is going to increase. And of course, you're going to have subtle changes in body composition. When we strength train, again, think about metabolism. We always got to think about that metabolic property. If we are weightlifting, how many calories are we really burning? Well, generally, if we do 3 reps and we do 10 sets, how long is our body burning energy? Well, if it takes, if we do 10 sets or 10 reps, you might be contracting for 20 seconds, right? And then you take a 2-minute rest and then you do it again, right? So metabolically, we're not burning a tremendous amount of calories. Now, how do we change that? Well, we get rid of that 2-minute rest. And if we get rid of that 2-minute rest, what do we have to do with the weight? We have to decrease the weight. So we can strength train, but what we would have to do is modify the intensity by reducing the rest time. And if we do reduce that rest time, we get out of that first tier of energy, which is ATP and PCR, right? We kind of move past that and we start to get into anaerobic glycolysis. And if we don't take any rest at all, like the HIIT training people, then you move right into that aerobic glycolysis, and then you move right into that aerobic metabolism being the primary energy source because you haven't rested. So there's ways to increase fat-free mass, which is muscle, and have more robust decreases in fat mass if we manipulate the intensity through rest periods, right? So if you look at the world's strongest men competitions, right? You watch those competitions on TV where those guys from like usually Norway and Denmark and, their names are like Maximus and Titus, and they're like, bench pressing the back of a 18-wheeler truck. Yeah, they're huge and they're massive and they're strong, strongest men on planet Earth, but they all have beer bellies, right? They're all very large kind of fat men, right? Because the capacity in which they train and exercise does not burn a tremendous amount of calories because they're doing heavy weight, which means maybe 6 reps with a 2-minute, 3-minute rest. And then they increase the weight and maybe they do 5 reps with another 2-3 minutes rest in between. So that rest period allows ATP to regenerate and takes them back to that first tier in energy metabolism, which is ATP PCR. So they never truly leave and get into sugar or fat metabolism, right? Because they operate within a very specific time frame. So again, everything's important, everything's connected. On this slide, we're going to talk a little bit more about that isokinetic muscle action. As I mentioned earlier, this is another form of dynamic movement. So we're kind of moving out of the isotonic, right, and moving into the isokinetic, where the speed of the contraction is kind of the focus here, right? So in isokinetic contractions, we can keep the speed at a constant rate. And if the speed is at a constant rate, that means that the load will remain constant, right? If we slow down the contraction, the load will lessen. If we increase the speed of the contraction, the load or the resistance will become greater. Now, these actions are super, super rare in sports. They're mainly performed in laboratories or under artificial conditions, such as when using machines. You guys are all, I mean, the only one that I could really think about that is really apparent is when we have those machines that are leg extension and leg curls, and the harder you contract, the more resistance that machine gives you. So if you're doing a leg extension, the harder you kick your leg out, the more resistance it gives you. The slower you kick your leg out, the more that resistance is constant. And again, they really occur in sports. Do they have a place? Absolutely. We use them a lot in the laboratory to see if there are inconsistencies in muscle strength between the left and the right leg or the left and the right arm. We can use them to see peak force. We can use them to see fatigue indexes. So we can use these types of machines to evaluate muscle performance, but they really don't serve a purpose in sports performance. So there's a video here that I have, and for some reason the sound is not playing on this, so I might just upload this video independently, or I might actually just leave it, because it's for all, you know, for strength gains and increases in performance. It really doesn't serve us a purpose, but I'm just gonna kind of hit it just to say we talked about it, you know what it is. So I'm going to just kind of modify this a little bit. I'm gonna go to, I think it was right at 45 seconds, right about here. So you can see that there's a machine here, and this individual is going to perform a leg press, and he can do either unilateral or bilateral, right? He could have one leg up or he could have two legs up, and he can control the rate at which he contracts. And if the rate is constant, the load is constant. If he slows down, the load is going to be less, or if he increases his force production and he contracts very quickly, the machine will cause counter load that is even greater, which means the contraction, he'll have to contract against more force. So, you know, that I just wanted to kind of talk about it and kind of go over that with you guys. And then the last one that we talked about is plyometrics. We're going to get into plyometrics a lot more in this course, but I just wanted to kind of touch on it with this dynamic movement so that you understand that we have an isometric work, we have dynamic work. Under that dynamic work, the dynamic work is kind of an umbrella term, and there's all these other sort of movement patterns under that umbrella term, and this is one of them. So just like everything else I've been telling you, you can work plyometrics independently, or you can work plyometrics with isotonic contractions, or that's what's so great about a weight room. It's like a laboratory, and you can design whatever you like. So I like this particular plyometric exercise because we are working concentric, eccentric contraction, but we're also working plyometrics. We're also working full range of motion with this squat. So you can see that the load is not very much, right? The load is going to be consistent. He's going to go down, he's going to come up. So there's going to be that concentric, eccentric work. And then on his way up, he is going to increase force production and do a jump. So there is the plyometric. So again, you can do a plyometric solely plyometric exercises where you're just working on quick eccentric, concentric contraction, loading, exploding, or you can also fold in resistance training, isotonic training with the plyometrics. So let's watch this for a second. Okay, that was pretty quick. Let's watch it one more time. All right, so we have a very forceful muscle contraction. His feet are coming off the ground. So let's talk quickly about muscle fibers, and we'll get into muscle fibers much more in this course, but let's talk about what we've seen. So let's go back. Let's go here. When we're doing an isometric contraction, we're generally working those type 2A fibers, right? Your strength fibers. So if we think metabolically, what are those metabolizing? Well, those are going to have a little bit of mitochondria, so they can get into the aerobic metabolism, but they're mostly going to have a lot of glycolytic hardware, right? Those type 2A fibers are going to generate a lot of lactic acid, a lot of lactate and hydrogen ions, which means that those fibers are going to preferentially want to use sugar. So that sugar is going to come into the muscle cell. It's going to undergo glycolysis, or it's going to come from stored glycogen in the muscle, and it's going to be metabolized in a way where you're going to produce lactate and lactate and hydrogen ions. Now, as you increase your ability to prolong isometric contractions, well, that glucose that's coming into the cell is going to be converted into pyruvate, and then it has a choice. Is it going to go into lactate conversion, or is that pyruvate going to enter the mitochondria and go into ATP formation in the mitochondria aerobically? And that's one of the adaptations that's going to happen. So isometric contraction is generally using those type 2A muscle fibers, and so are these dynamic muscle contractions, right? So this one's going to use a lot of the type 2A fibers preferentially. This one's going to use a lot of the type 2A fibers, and this one's going to use a lot of the type 2X fibers, right? So, and that's going to change metabolism. The type 2X fibers are going to generally stay within that first tier of metabolism, which is going to be stored ATP in the cell and PCR, right? So phosphocreatine. So again, everything's connected, everything's important. You have to know how to train every aspect of the muscle, the neuron, the metabolism. Okay. So let's just kind of start variable resistance training, okay? And this is just another way of dynamic training, okay? So this one involves equipment with a lever arm, a cam, or a pulley, right? You guys know these types of machines, right? And what they're really good at doing is they apply various resistance throughout exercises range of motion. So it's a way to keep tension on a muscle even if a muscle is starting to fatigue. So these pulley machines are really, really important when you are doing a strength and conditioning program. So especially for keeping constant tension, keeping the muscle under constant tension through a series of reps and sets. And these things kind of work around strength curves, okay? And that's what they're designed to do, is they're designed to counter where you have weaknesses in strength curves. So there's basically three types of strength curves that we talk about in exercise physiology. There's ascending, so you can see this going here. There's descending, this going here. And then we can see this bell-shaped curve where our maximum strength output is here, right? So there's different types of exercise that kind of mimic this and mirror these types of variability in strength. So when we have a bench press, we have an ascending strength curve, right? And what that means is as the weight gets closer to locking out, right? So when we press up here, we get stronger, right? So if we look at this mechanic here, most people, once they bring the weight down and the weight is here over their chest, that is where they are at their weakest, right? And as they arch their back and they help get that bar up a little bit, once they get to this point right about here, they can press up effortlessly because they get stronger as the weight gets further from their chest, right? Here they're weak. As the weight gets further from their chest, they get stronger, right? So the muscle can perform more efficiently. So if I were to say, let's just kind of beat a dead horse here because that's what we do. I'm going to draw. Let me get the Humboldt space pen out, okay? If we think of a muscle contraction with a bench press, here is where the weight is on the rack. Here is where the weight is touching our chest. Right about here is the threshold where we get stronger and the weight becomes easier to press. All right, and that is going to be right about this point right here. All right, you guys see those lines I'm drawing? Or maybe I should draw, let me see, let's do green. Right about here is where, so from this point up, it gets easier to press that weight. From this point down, it gets harder to move that weight, right? And this arrow would be representing this part of the curve. And then this green right here would be representing this part of the curve, right? So when we're talking about these pulley systems, it's a way for the load to remain constant, right? So that's how those things are designed, and that's why they're really, really important, right? So we know that the muscle is weakest here and strongest here. So, you know, some people, to work this area here where they are weak, and we talked about cadences. Remember, I talked about 2-3-2 or 4-2-4 or whatnot. If I said, let me see, if I said 3, I'm drawing with my right hand, but I'm left-handed, 2, 3, that would mean 3 seconds down, 2 seconds hold, 3 seconds up. What does that hold? We don't let the weight rest on our chest. It's an isometric contraction. So let's say this sticking point is really tough for me. I have no strength here. I can't develop any strength when that bar is being held over my chest. Well, there's an easy way to fix that. Let's say 3, 4, 3, right? I increase the time of that isometric contraction. Now at the beginning of this, the way I'm approaching this bench press, I might need somebody behind me to help me get the weight up on the press because I've just exhausted my energy on that isometric contraction. But even though I'm exhausting that energy, I'm creating strength there that hasn't been there, right? So I might say, okay, I'm weak here. I'm going to do a 4, 4, and then I'm going to have I'm just going to put an S for spotter. My spotter is going to help get the weight back up. So 4 seconds down, right, eccentrically, 4 seconds isometric, and then my spotter is going to help me with the concentric contraction, right? And that is how I can address this type of strength curve where here, this point, I am weak, right? So if I did that type of exercise, what would happen? Well, if I'm looking at my strength curve, it would shift up. I would then have more strength here, right? So that's how that would work. Now, there's also descending strength curves. And if we look at, let's say, this upright row here, we can see that we are strongest up here at this point, right? So this is where the muscle is most contracted. We have the most force production and we have the highest amount of strength. And down here, where the bar is at here, we are at our lowest force production, okay? And what you'll see a lot of times when people are doing this exercise and the weight is too heavy, they will use their hips and throw that kind of weight up so they can get it to this point right about here. See, I love this pen. It's so fun to draw. And then once it's here, those primary movers, the shoulders here, can take over and make the contraction work, right? So there's strength curves that move in that opposite direction. It just depends on what muscle group we're talking about, okay? Just conceptually understand that we have ascending and descending strength curves. We also have these bell-shaped strength curves where we have the most force. The muscle is at its strongest here, right about here, and it is weakest here and here. And I have this person doing curls here, right? So here would represent that point, and then let me change the color here. And here would represent that point, right? So again, when the weight is too heavy, when people are doing curls, they generally tend to use their hips and throw that weight up to a point here where the muscle can engage and produce the most amount of force and have the most strength, right? And let me change the color here just so we can just kind of here. Let's go black. Dot, 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 right? And this area represents that part right there, okay? So what that means is that when the bicep is at this point, that's her arm. I'm drawing her arm, okay? That is where we have the most strength, right? And as that bicep moves up this direction, right, we start to lose strength. All right? So that's how this works. And I have another slide here that kind of talks about everything I just told you about, right? And we're going to stop right here. You can read this because that's a lot for you guys to chew on. And you have the whole weekend to kind of chew on that. And just remember that we are leaving off on variable resistance training. And we're talking about these arms, these levers, these pulley machines, and how these pulley machines are designed to help overcome strength curves, right? So that when we are doing a bench press or an upright row on a pulley machine, these machines are designed to keep constant tension, and then over here, constant tension on the muscle. So it's meant to counteract these strength curves. All right, so keep that in mind. You can read that on your own, and this is the final slide. We are going to pick up this next week, and we'll finish out chapter 2 with lecture 2B. That is all I have for you guys. Have a wonderful day.